This week I was having a conversation with a group of middle school students. This week the country was remembering September 11, and I was talking to a group of kids who were born after that. And one of the things that we were talking about was how airline travel has completely changed since 9/11. And they were totally shocked when I told them that you could actually go all the way up to the gate when you were sending somebody off to leave. You didn't have to just drop them off at the curb. You could actually walk all the way up to the gate. And that when you got onto the plane, even if it was a short flight of a couple of hours, that when you sat down, they gave you a meal and it was included in the price. Like you actually got to eat on a plane and they didn't charge you $14 for half a turkey sandwich. It was a completely different time. You never had to take your shoes off to go through and get on security. And they were shocked. Their faces were just like, I can't believe that world ever actually existed. But it did. And it got me thinking about how in a previous life, in the late 80s and early 90s, I did a lot of traveling between here and Asia. I was going back and forth between the Philippines and Hong Kong. Probably for a few years, it was maybe 7 or 8 times a year. I was going back and forth for work. And as one of the benefits was that you always looked for a good deal. So I got to fly a lot of different airlines when I was going back and forth to Asia. But there was one airline that I never flew, and that was Korean Airlines. And the reason I didn't fly wasn't because that it wasn't a good airline, and it wasn't because that it was going to take extra longer to get there or because it cost too much. The reason I didn't fly Korean, as many people did, is that in the early 90s, around that time, they had a lot of trouble with their airplanes. They had a lot of mishaps, they had a couple of crashes, and no one wanted to fly Korean Airlines. And so they tried to figure out what was it in those particular planes with that particular airline that was causing all of these problems. And so they looked naturally first, they looked at whether or not the pilots had been properly trained. And they had been. They had gone to the best flight schools. Many of them were former military, so the pilots knew how to fly the planes. So then they thought, okay, maybe it was the equipment. But they checked the equipment that Korean Airlines was flying. They were flying the top-of-the-line Boeing and Airbus planes. Couldn't figure out what was going on. The rest of the airlines around the world were fine. This particular one was a problem. So what they did was they got the little black box and they started to listen to the conversation in the cockpit to see what was going wrong, where things were breaking down. And what they found out was that the reason that they were having problems with their flights in this particular airline, it had nothing to do with the training, it had nothing to do with the planes, it had to do with the culture of people in Korea. Like in many, many places outside of the Western world, in Korea, they have a culture, a strong culture for paying deference to the older people who are with you. So if there is someone with you who is older, you never speak against them, you never criticize them, you never complain, and whatever they say, you agree. And so in Korea, that type of dynamic in their culture was so strong that when they would have the pilot and the co-pilot in the plane, and the pilot was usually older and the co-pilot was younger, that the co-pilot would see that there was a problem on the plane. And instead of saying, hey, there's this problem on the plane, we need to stop this or do something differently, the co-pilot would make a very, very subtle suggestion. Like instead of saying, oh, look, it looks like our wing is going to fall off. Instead of, hey, the wing is going to fall off, we have to do something here. And so it would just be a suggestion, a very, very docile suggestion, instead of, hey, this is what you have to do. But you see, in most commercial airlines, in fact, as far as I know right now, in all commercial airlines, there is a pilot and a co-pilot, but they are both pilots. They both are the ones that are in charge of the plane. They both have the authority to do whatever it takes to keep their passengers safe. And the problem that they found out that Korean Airlines was having was that the co-pilot, who meant in many cases, because he was younger, he could see things a little bit faster, and he was probably trained in the most recent stuff. He saw it, but the co-pilot didn't understand that he had authority when he was in the cockpit. And because he didn't understand his authority, and because he allowed his authority to be passed on, and he didn't claim it and he didn't use it, the people who he was put in charge of taking care of on that plane, they are the ones that suffered. Because that person did not understand what his authority was. So today, as we are in week 3 of this month where we have been talking about discipleship and the importance of discipleship, today what I want to talk about is the authority of the disciple. Because I think part of our problem is, and when I say our, I don't mean you and me who are sitting here today, maybe those of you who are watching us online. I don't mean Message of Peace. I don't mean the churches here in our city. I'm talking about those of us who call ourselves Christians, those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus. That our big problem is that we walk around not understanding what our authority is. And if we don't know what our authority is, then just like those pilots on the plane, there are people that have been put into our care that will suffer because we don't exercise the authority that we were given. So we started off this month in the first week, and Pastor Fernando kind of set the tone, and he said this. He said, to be a Christian, you have to be a disciple. That you can't be a Christian without being a disciple. And what he told us in that first week was, listen, if you're going to call yourself a Christian, you can't just sit in the pews for a couple of hours every week. That you have a responsibility to be a disciple. That you have a responsibility not just to be a disciple, but to disciple other people. And then last week we came back and we talked about that, listen, discipling is important, but there is a cost to discipleship. And the cost of discipleship is putting Jesus first in every area of our lives. We've got to put him first. And what was the great thing that we saw was that when we say, yes, I'm willing to put you first, ahead of my family, ahead of my friends, ahead of my career, that Jesus uses our willingness to put him first to bless our families and to bless our friends and to bless our careers, to bless every area of our lives. That he does that. So we say, okay, Jesus, I get it. I want to be a follower. I want to be a Christian. I agree that I want to be a disciple. I understand what the cost is. Hey, I see what the reward is. But now what? What do I do? What am I responsible for next? Well, I don't know if you have ever seen the movies or watched the television shows or read the comics, but are there any Spider-Man fans here today? I see some of you raising your hand. I see some of you kind of going like this because you don't want to admit it publicly, right? Yeah, I do watch it. I used to read the comics when I was younger. There was one line that started out in the comics. It went into the television show, and now it went into the last couple of movies, and it's really popular. And the line goes like this: with great power comes great responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility. And what I want to tell you today is that with the authority of a disciple comes great responsibility. That if we are granted the authority to be a disciple, and that's what we're going to talk about today, but we're going to finish it up because in this passage that we're going to look at, in this conversation that Jesus has with his disciples, not only is he going to show us and explain to us where we get our authority to be a disciple, he is going to remind us that with that authority comes responsibility. That we have a responsibility as a disciple. That we don't just get to have the authority, but there's something that we have to do. So we're going to start, and Matthew, who was one of Jesus' disciples, he wrote an account of all of these things, and Matthew is recalling now as he's writing in his book this conversation that Jesus had, and it's in Matthew 16, verse 13, and I know everyone brought their Bibles today, right? So we're going to follow along. You can follow along with me. I am going to be in the New Living Translation. So if you don't have that, what I'm going to be reading is up on the wall. But since we all bring our Bibles to church every week, I know you've got it in your laps right now. So this is how it goes. It starts off like this. It says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Now, Caesarea Philippi was a very, very pagan region in the Roman Empire. It was full of temples to Roman gods, to old Babylonian gods. There were very, very few followers of Jesus in this area. In fact, if you look at the characteristics of Caesarea Philippi from that time, it is very, very similar to the metropolitan culture that you and I live in here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And there is, back then, as it is for some of you have experienced this here in the Bay Area, it's not just an indifference to Jesus, but sometimes there's actual hostility towards anyone who calls themselves a Jesus follower. And so Jesus, because Jesus did not sit in the comfort of where he was surrounded by friends, in the comfort of where he knew the people around him, Jesus was always going out to where people were that needed to see him and that needed to meet him. Jesus takes his disciples and they go to Caesarea Philippi. And in that region, with the backdrop of this completely pagan culture, he stops and he asks his disciples, who do the people say the Son of Man is? In other words, he says, listen, you're out there talking to people. Who are people saying I am? What are they saying about me? And so they answered. It says, they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Now listen to what they are saying. See, these people that they're talking about, there's a mindset that you have to kind of pick up on by the people who they're saying that Jesus could be. So first they say he could be John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist and Jesus were cousins, so they probably had some similar features, and you might have mistaken him for that. But John the Baptist was very peculiar because John the Baptist was somebody who went out and he preached dangerous messages. He preached sermons that got him thrown out. They got people throwing stuff at him. I mean, eventually he preached a sermon that got him beheaded. Think of what that sermon was. This was not a guy who was preaching so that people would like him. And John the Baptist was preaching all over the countryside with a call to national repentance. In other words, his call was that we have lost our way. It's time for us as a nation to turn back to God. And then he says Elijah and Jeremiah. And so now they're talking about the prophets. And both Elijah and Jeremiah had something in common, and that was that they were both calling the nation to stand up against corruption and corrupt leaders. So there's one person that they thought he was who was calling for national repentance. There was two other people who said stand up to corruption and corrupt leaders. You see, the mindset of the people who saw Jesus but didn't know exactly who Jesus was, their mindset was, we are looking for a military Messiah. We are looking for a political Messiah. We are looking for someone who is going to do something for us. Someone to help us get rid of these people, these Romans who are occupying our land. See, they were looking for a Jesus that was going to do what they wanted him to do. And so Jesus looks at them and he kind of gets this idea, okay, I see what the people are saying. But what about you? Who do you say I am? What about you? You guys have been with me for a couple of years now. You've heard my preaching. You've listened to my teaching. You've seen the miracles. You've been as close to me as anyone ever can be. What do you have to say? Who do you think I am. And then Simon Peter, who is kind of like the spokesman of the bunch, you all have this friend in your group of friends. You know, the guy that speaks too fast, is always getting into trouble. You know that guy in your group of friends? If you don't have that guy in your group of friends, you are that guy. All right? It is you. We all have one. In their group, it was Simon Peter. And he says this, in verse 16, he says, Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, I want you to get this, because he did not repeat himself. He did not just simply use two names that talk about Jesus. He was saying two specific things. First of all, you are the Messiah. You are the one who is going to save us. And then he says, unlike all of these people here in Caesarea Philippi who are worshiping dead gods, you are the Son of the living God. See, he was acknowledging that Jesus was two things. He was a Savior and he was a God. That not only was Jesus going to do something for us, but that Jesus was going to do something in us. He was the Messiah and he was the living God. And Jesus replies in the next verse, he says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." It's the next slide. There you go. And that word revealed is the same word that is the title of the last book of the Bible, Revelation. This was a revelation to Peter. And what he was saying was, listen, this isn't something that you sat down at a coffee shop and were thinking about and writing notes and you figured it out on your own. This isn't something that came out from your own reasoning. That this was something that came to you from someplace else. That this is something that came to you not from something in the world, but something from out of the world. From his Father in heaven. That this was a revelation. I have to tell you that for many, many years, especially back in the time before I really met Jesus, and you may have heard me say this before, that when I was growing up, people introduced me to a cardboard cutout of Jesus. And it wasn't until I was almost in my 30s when I realized that it was a two-dimensional piece of wood and not the real Jesus. And then I finally met him, and he was a completely different person than the person that I was told about, that it was not him. And so here he's saying, listen, when I would hear people say stuff like this, like God spoke to me, or I heard it in my heart. And I was so skeptical of people who would say things like that. Like, come on, really? God spoke to you? I mean, what? Did you just hear the voice coming out, or what happened? But see, Matthew records Jesus talking about this, that he's confirming that indeed God can speak into our hearts. That there are revelations that come inside us, that come from somewhere outside us. That we actually can hear God speak into our hearts. That he does reveal things to us. And so here, Jesus is saying, listen, Peter, you didn't figure this out on your own. You didn't look at the landscape and look at all the things that I've been telling you and figure this out. You didn't come to this conclusion. Something came in you, and that was from my Father in heaven. And so in the next verse it says this, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now, this verse has come up over the years, over the centuries, with so much conjecture and so much argument over what this verse really means. In fact, our Roman Catholic friends will tell you that what this verse means is that Peter was the one that the church was going to be built on, and they will tell you that Peter was the first pope, and so they love Peter, and we love Peter, but this verse has been controversial for people to understand what that means. So I want to look at it today, and I want to let you draw your own conclusions. When we look at this verse and it says, I tell you that you are Peter, he's doing a name change. He's saying, you were Simon, now you're going to be Peter. Peter was Peter's Roman name. So it wasn't a brand new name. It was already a name that he had used, but he only used it when he was among Romans. See, it was a call for him to step out of the place that he was used to and to go to a place where there are people who didn't know Jesus. See, and he says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Now, if you translate those two words, Peter and rock, into the Greek, it looks like this. It's Jesus is saying that you are Petros, Peter, and on this Petra I will build my church. You see, he didn't use, in the Greek, when they translate this, they didn't use the same word. He didn't say, you are Petros, and on this Petros I will build my church. And those two words, they essentially mean rock, but there is a distinct difference between the two. Petros are small rocks, and Petra is a big, large rock. See, there's a difference. And so when he says you are Petros, a small rock, but on this Petra is going to be the foundation. It's where I am going to build my church. In fact, later on, Peter would write this. He would say, and we don't have the text for this, but this is in 1 Peter 2, 4, and 5. He would say that all of us are living Petras, that we're all living stones, that we're all living rocks, and that each one of us is what builds the church. See, St. Peter, who listened to Jesus say this, is the same Peter who wrote that. And then he says, he concludes it with this. He says, back up one. I will build my church. Now, this is a tough one for us, especially for those who are in leadership, because we can easily fall into this trap where we're thinking that Pastor Caesar, have to build the church, that Pastor Max has to build the church, that Pastor Paulo has to build the church. And nowhere are we given that responsibility. Who's going to build the church? Jesus will build his church, right? He is not going to build your church. He is not going to build their church. He's not going to build my church. He is going to build his church. He's going to build his church. And it's interesting because that word church is a word that doesn't mean building. It doesn't mean organization. It means a movement, a gathering of people, a congregation. He says, listen, what I'm going to be putting together, what I'm going to be doing is to build something that is more than just one location. It is going to be a movement of people that is going to change the world. And then listen to how he ends it, because this is fascinating to me. He says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, this is strange, isn't it? How many of you have gates in your home? Okay, you have doors, right? I know, because we live in the city. So I think I've said before, for 15 years, my family, we lived in Central Florida in a very, very small town. I think there was probably only like 10,000 people in our town. So it was small, and there was lots of land. Because there's one thing Florida has. No, it's two things Florida has. Mosquitoes and land. And there was a lot of it. And we had fences. And those fences have gates, because that's how you go in and out. And the gates that we have, they are defensive, right? We have gates to keep people out, to allow people to come through. But when I lock that gate, it means don't come through here. But here, Jesus is saying that the gates of hell overcome things. Now, come on. What is he talking about? How does a gate overcome anything? I mean, unless you're an idiot and you swing the gate open and you stand there and then the gate swings back and slaps you in the head, right? How is a gate going to overcome anything? How does that happen? Well, we had a neighbor when we were living there, and the neighbor built his fence right up to the edge of our property line. He built it right there. And you know what one of the largest or the most frequent causes of problems between neighbors, not here in the Bay Area where we don't have fences, but in other places in the country? You know what is the most frequent problem that they have? Is that the property line changes whenever the gate or whenever the fence moves. So the fence goes down and you put up the fence and you say, okay, well, I'm going to estimate where the property line is, and that's where I put the fence. And all of a sudden, if you move that fence from here to here, now you've got an extra foot of property. Are you tracking with me? Whenever you change the location of the fence, your property increases. And the big problem that people have is that they will put the fence in wherever they think it should be. So how does a fence, how does a wall overcome something? You know how it overcomes something? It overcomes something by opening up and enlarging the territory of the area that it's covering. So how do these gates overcome? They overcome by the kingdom of darkness, by hell itself getting bigger and bigger and bigger. See, as that gate moves, the wall moves. As that gate moves, the wall moves. And every time the wall moves, every time the gate moves, every time the fence gets bigger, the kingdom inside it gets bigger. And what Jesus is saying here is, listen, when I build my church, the gates of hell stop right here. They do not move. In fact, we're going to start pushing up on that gate and closing in on that kingdom. And our kingdom is going to be what is growing. See, that's how it's going to happen. The gates don't overcome us by somebody picking up a metal gate and hitting us over the head with it. They overcome by increasing the territory of Hades, of hell. And Jesus is saying, listen, you see this city that we are in? You see all of these people who are worshiping pieces of rock and pieces of stone and the skeletons of dead animals? It stops right here. And then he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. See, he's telling them, okay, listen, I'm going to build my church, and we are going to stop the gates of hell right here. Now, let me tell you how we're going to do it. I am going to give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, here's my problem. I was supposed to have my car keys with me, but they're over there. But let me tell you this. Just imagine for a moment. All of our family car keys, they have this ring. They're two rings, and they're connected by a little bar that detaches. And on one side is the key to the car, and then on the other side is the key to the house and the key to the church. And I think that's it. I don't like a lot of keys. It makes your pocket way down. So all of our cars, they have this. And the reason is that whenever we go to the mechanic or whenever we go and have valet service at a restaurant, I do not want to give them the keys to my house. I want them to have the keys to the car so that they can move the car and gently take care of it. But I don't want them to have the keys to my house because that's not the authority that I am giving them. Right? Because when you give somebody keys, you're giving them authority. You're giving them permission. You're giving them the ability to enter into whatever it is you're giving them the keys for. And that freaks me out, especially at night. Like, you have a really, really big dinner, and now you're laying in bed and you're thinking, what if that guy made a copy of my house keys and he's coming into my house? You don't want that. And so I make sure that all of our keys have that detachment so you can detach the car keys if you ever have to give somebody authority over your car without giving them authority over your house. Keys give you the authority. Now, I want you to look at this because there are three things that we need to know about keys because, you see, even in this particular time, they understood what the keys meant. In this particular time and in this culture, when the king gave responsibility to one of his servants or to one of the people in his household, when he gave them authority, you know what he would do? he would take the key, he would put it on a chain or a rope, and he would hang it around the neck of the person he was giving authority to. See, the key wasn't as important as opening doors as it was letting everybody know that the person who has that key has the authority of the king. And keys allow us to do three things. The first thing is that when we have the keys to a house, the keys give me the right to be in the house. I have the right to be in the house, right? So when somebody says, hey, can you watch my house? I'm going to be going on vacation, and they give you the keys to the house, that you have the right to go in there. You have the right to open the door. You have the right to walk around, make sure everything is okay. You have the right to eat the cheesecake that's in the fridge. I mean, you have all of the rights to be in the house, right? But the second thing that the key does is it allows you to live in the house. Because most people who want you to house sit, or most people when you're renting a house from somebody, or when you buy a new house and you get the keys to it, you don't say, oh, this is wonderful, I have the keys to the house, and then go to the front yard and set up a tent and live outside, right? We don't do that. Because when we have the keys to the house, not only do we have the authority to be in the house, we have the authority to live in the house, the right to live in the house. But the third thing is this, and perhaps this is the most important thing, that when you have the keys to the house, when you have the keys, you have the right to control who comes in and to forbid people from coming in, right? You decide who comes in to the house when you have the keys. I have the keys to my house, and I get to decide if you come in or not. Isn't that why we all have that little peephole in our doors? Right? Because we want to look first and decide before we open the door if you can come into my house. Here's a tip. Bring a pizza. You're always welcome to come into my house. Right? That's your key. So with the key, we get the right to control who comes in to the house and who comes out of the house, or who we get forbid from coming into the house. Now listen. We have been given the keys to the kingdom, which means you and I get to decide who gets to come into the kingdom and who is kept out of the kingdom. Listen to me. There are some of us in this room who there are people in our lives who desperately need to be in the kingdom, and we are keeping the door closed. We have been given the keys. We get to control who goes in and who goes out. The church father, Martin Luther, when he was talking about these verses, what he said was that the keys to the kingdom is preaching. And I'm not talking about just preaching from up here. This is an important aspect of it. But I'm talking about preaching in the sense of telling people about Jesus. Talking to people about Jesus. In fact, there's this quote that you may have heard that most people attribute to St. Francis of Assisi, which is not really the person who said it, but it says, how does it go again? I wrote it down here. Preach the gospel at all times. Use words if necessary. How many of us are living our lives, a life that when people look at the way we live our life, we're preaching the gospel? How many of us are really doing that? Are you thinking right now of the place where you are not preaching the gospel? I know exactly where I don't preach the gospel. It's when I'm driving. I am that guy, that speeds up and slows down. That's me. Lord, forgive me. I'm so bad at that. That is where if somebody was sitting down next to me in the car watching me drive, which is a good thing that my wife sleeps while I'm driving, or she would think differently of me. But listen, I am that guy. I don't preach the gospel while I'm driving. Where is it that you don't preach the gospel in your life? Because people are looking at us. And we have the keys to the kingdom. And every time we do something that gives people a bad impression of God, we are locking the door for that person and not allowing them to enter into the kingdom. We're locking the door on them. We have the key. Jesus goes on and he says this. He says, I'm going to give you the keys, And then look, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, over the years, there have been many pastors and preachers who've really taken a lot of license on this. And then in a larger, broader sense, there is some truth to the fact that you can bind stuff on earth and that God does something when we pray to him because he hears our prayers, and there are things that we want to bind. Disease, sickness, we want to get rid of all of those things. Health, prosperity, generosity, love, we want to loose those things. But this is a weird way to translate it because in the Greek, the phrasing of this is what they call periphrastic future perfect tense. So you learned a little bit of Greek today. It's called periphrastic future perfect tense. And so when it says whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, that's not exactly how it should be translated. It should be translated more like this: whatever you bind on earth shall have already been bound in heaven. See, future perfect periphrastic. Whatever you're going to do, it's already been done. And whatever you loose on earth shall have already been loosed in heaven. You see, this is not a license for us to go around binding and loosing anything that we want to. That's not what it was intended to be. It was intended to be an acknowledgement that long before we were here, God had a plan. And his plan was that all of the things that are in our lives that are keeping us from the kingdom need to be bound. And all of the things that are in our lives or that are missing from our lives, for us to really, really live into the kingdom, need to be loosed. Those phrases, whatever you bind on earth, bound in heaven, all of those things, the people who were listening to him at that time, they understood those because those were phrases that they heard and used all the time. They were phrases like the phrases we use, like, what's up, right? When we say what's up, we don't literally mean what's going on up there, right? It's just a term that we used. For them in this time, these are just terms that they used, and what they understood from those terms was that what we're talking about is the ability to let people know something and to keep people away from something. That's what they were talking about. And in this context, what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about his kingdom is this entire idea that we are not yet forgiven. For too long, and out of a place of love, we've let people come to this conclusion that we have to earn our way to God. And there are probably people in your life right now who you may have even invited them to church. You may have invited them to a connection group. And they're thinking to themselves this: I'd really like to go. And as soon as I clean up my act, I'm going to go with you. But they never tell you that. See, someone hasn't told them yet that when Jesus died on the cross, he paid the price for their sin, that they were already forgiven. Someone hasn't told them yet that forgiveness is free, that you don't have to earn your way to it, that it is already there for you. Someone hasn't told them that yet. Someone hasn't bound that information to them. Someone hasn't loosed that idea into their brain. Not yet. That's what you and I are here for. That's what you and I are supposed to do. Because as we've been given the keys to the kingdom, our authority, as that has been given to us, we also have the responsibility to do something with it, to make a difference in the lives of the people who are around us. The people who we know and love and see every day, and the people who are, and I've said this before, that lady who's in the 15 items or less line with clearly 24 items. I mean, It's hard to not roll your eyes or make a comment, but Jesus died for her as much as she died for you and me. So what are we doing? How come we haven't made a difference yet? So Jesus tells them all this, and then he wraps it up with this. He says, then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Now that's kind of strange, right? They figured it out. They know who I am. I'm telling them, listen, you're going to be given the authority to do these things, but wait, don't tell anybody yet. Now remember when he was talking about the keys of the kingdom? You notice that Jesus didn't say, you have been given the keys of the kingdom, or I now present you with keys to the kingdom. No, what did he say? He said, I will give you, future, I will give you the keys of the kingdom. You see, they're not going to get the authority, they're not going to get any of that yet until Jesus has been crucified, until he rose from the dead, and the Holy Spirit came. Because when the Holy Spirit came, they got power. And it was in that moment that they received the keys to the kingdom. Well, it's 2,000 years later, and you and I, we have a great